privilege to introduce Noor Johnson to this week's Lunch and Learn. I got to meet Noor a couple of weeks ago when we were chatting about our various mutual interests around sort of climate change and environmental studies, et cetera, et cetera. She's going to give us, I think, a really fascinating talk. Hashtag, this is my first hashtag Lunch and Learn talk. So hashtag Unite Against Seismic, Inuit Strategies to Protect the Arctic Marine Environment. And she comes to us from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where she has a position, but she also has a position at the National Snow and Ice Data Center, which I find like super interesting. So she's an anthropologist embedded in a data center, and it just reminds me of how important it is to think about how we use our data and how we make sure that it's culturally relevant and that we're talking to the people that the data impact. So I can't wait to hear your presentation, and I'd like to have you welcome Noor Johnson to give today's Lunch and Learn.
All right, it looks like we're having some access requests that.
Yeah,
okay, that's okay. Well, great. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm really glad that so many of you came on the last Thursday before your spring break. So thank you for coming. And also thank you for inviting me to talk about my research. I am relatively new to the Tufts community. I'm a researcher at the Science Diplomacy Center at the Fletcher School. And I also have the pleasure of teaching a class in the anthropology department this spring. And so I'm still sort of learning my way around Tufts and have really enjoyed this community of the Lunch and Learn. So thank you for inviting me to come. I am going to talk today about a project that I did a few years ago. I have been visiting the Eastern Canadian Arctic for about 10 years. And I have worked on several different research projects there. And so this is, you know, I'm really sorry that you can't see this very well. A lot of what I wanted to share with you was in the images of this PowerPoint. It may be a little easier to see from closer up, but I think that's just what we get with a sunny day. So I will try to tell you what you're seeing if it's really hard to see. So what you're seeing here is a picture of me cooking seal meat. This was one of the first times I went up to the Arctic, and this was part of my education in the community that I was working in. They were cooking seal meat outside. It's summertime, and they're cooking it using heather, which is this very wispy little plant. That's, if you can imagine trying to cook a whole pot of seal meat, you just have to constantly feed it heather. And then this is me in Copenhagen. I am at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change talks with the Inuit Circumpolar Council, which is an Inuit organization that works on a lot of different issues, bringing Inuit perspectives on culture and environment and economy into global discussions. And then finally over here, this is a picture from the Museum of Natural History. I was at the Smithsonian briefly, working as a science policy advisor, actually. So I come to this topic from a range of perspectives, and I am not going to talk about data particularly, but I will be talking about knowledge and information access. So that's relevant to data. So what you can't see very well here is, and I wanted to kind of invite you into this discussion in two ways. So the first invitation is the way that many of us situated in the South enter into the Arctic these days. And this is from thinking about the impact of climate change on the region. And what this is a graphic that's been developed by NASA. It's showing the decline of sea ice in the region, and in particular, it's showing the decline of multi-year sea ice. So the second image, you can sort of make out here that the very bright white is the multi-year sea ice. And this is the sea ice extent in September, comparing 1984 to 2016. So this is when it would be at its minimum for the year. And so this is a way that a lot of us are starting to become aware of the Arctic region and the impact of climate change on the region. The melting sea ice has caused a lot of interest in the sort of geopolitical arena as well. So at the Fletcher School, people have been thinking about offshore context different countries that are entering into the geopolitics of the Arctic. And some of those interests, a lot of those interests are rooted in the access to natural resources that are becoming more available with the melting sea ice. So this is a picture of offshore oil. And there has been a study by the US Geological Survey that suggests that about 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas resources and 13% of the undiscovered oil resources are in the Arctic, in the offshore, in 500 meters or less, covered by 500 meters or less of water. There are many other mineral resources that people are also interested in accessing in the Arctic, and they're becoming more accessible because ships are having an easier time transiting the northern waters with less ice. So this is a picture, this image over here is the Northwest Passage, which is sort of the famous passage that explorers have been seeking in the Arctic in their early expeditions. And the shipping industry is very interested in the Northwest Passage because it will take about 10 days less to transit from Asia to Europe using the Northwest Passage than it currently takes to go the more conventional shipping route through the Panama Canal. So these are sort of some of the sort of macro level geopolitical interests in the Arctic. And these are pictures that are showing the way that Inuit are thinking about and experiencing environmental change. So these are some images that are from a really wonderful book called The Meaning of Ice. If you're a student at Tufts, I've asked the library to buy this book. I hope they have bought it. It was a recent award-winning book showing, it was based on a project that Inuit did who are from 3 different parts of the Arctic, and they're comparing and exchanging knowledge about how they use the sea ice in their daily lives. So this is a picture of how Inuit hunt seal through the breathing hole, the seal's breathing hole, and then this is a picture showing how they're butchering the seal on the sea ice. So after it was hunted, then they're butchering the seal right in place. And this is a picture of a polar bear hunting a seal, also at the seal's breathing hole, and the title is Polar Bears Hunt Seals the Same Way We Did. And it really shows the way that Inuit know the Arctic and the Arctic animals in a very personal way. So the polar bear is an icon of climate change, and a lot of conservation organizations have used the polar bear as sort of an image of how the Arctic and its wildlife are threatened by climate change. And Inuit have a very different relationship to polar bears, and this is sort of showing how they know and have a personal connection with the Arctic wildlife and Arctic animals. And of course, the interest in Arctic resources is nothing new. So this is an image of whaling ships. It's taken from a painting of whaling ships that are overwintering in the ice in Baffin Bay. And this was a practice that started, around, I guess, around 1870 and thereafter, when whalers, before then they would come seasonally and leave, and then they started to realize that there was an economic saving of leaving the ship there over winter. And this is when Inuit and whalers started to have a lot more contact, because they were just basically sitting there. Their ship was stuck in the ice until it would melt and they would be able to leave again. And the whalers were there to harvest bowhead whales. And so they started to come further north as the bowhead whale stocks declined in the Atlantic Ocean. And then when eventually the stocks were so depleted that it became hard to harvest them economically, at the same time, there was a shift in technology so that oil from whales stopped being the primary oil used for heating and other purposes, and petroleum development began at sort of around the same time in the early 1920s. So then in the Eastern Arctic, the point of contact and the sort of resource that was being extracted was the fox pelt. And this is when the Hudson's Bay Company came in and built trading stations across the northern landscape and had invited Inuit to come and trade Arctic fox pelts. And so this became a major point of contact and a major part of Inuit economy at that time. And roughly the same time, right around 1920, the first oil discovery was made in the Western Canadian Arctic in the town of Norman Wells. And that was an onshore discovery, starting in about the 1950s and escalating in the 1960s and 70s. The extractive industry became very interested in the offshore in the Canadian Arctic. And this is a picture from 1982 of an oil well, an oil rig in the Beaufort Sea that was owned by Dome Petroleum. Dome was one of many companies that was doing seismic testing and exploratory drilling. They drilled, I believe, about 170 some odd offshore wells during this period. None of them proved to be economically, there wasn't enough of a deposit to go ahead and invest in full-on extraction, but there was a lot of activity at that time. And this process of exploration is really what drove Inuit communities across northern Canada to pursue land claim agreements with the Canadian government. So particularly in the Western Canadian Arctic, the Inuvialuit settlement region land claim process began to be negotiated because literally Inuit were waking up and seeing oil rigs outside, offshore, and they had no ability to say whether or not this should be happening, and they had no ability to benefit from any resources that might be discovered. And so the land claim negotiation process took place in that region, and that was the first region to begin. And there are now, as you can see, 4 Inuit land claim settlements that have happened. So the land claim that we'll be talking about today is the Nunavut land claim. This is in the Eastern Canadian Arctic. It's also the largest land claim area. The Nunavut territory is just slightly smaller than the country of Mexico. So it's a huge area. There are 35,000 people who live there. So it's like this very vast territory with a very small population. And Inuit live not only in northern Canada, but they also live in northern Alaska and in Greenland and in Chukotka, Russia. So the map on the right-hand side shows the broad Inuit territory, and they work and exchange strategies at the circumpolar level. And I'm not going to talk about that particularly today, but it is something to kind of keep in mind. This is a picture that shows a little bit more clearly the land claim regions. This one over here is the Inuvialuit settlement region, and you can see that it extends into the offshore. The Nunavut land claim does not include the offshore, and that's very important in terms of what happened with the seismic testing project that we're going to be talking about. So the Nunavut land claim basically is sort of just off the shore, basically at the point of where the land-fast ice ends. And so what I want to do now is to bring you to Clyde River, or Kangitugapik, which is the Inuktitut name for Clyde River. Clyde River is, if you're looking back at this map, it's located here, sort of midway up the coast of the northern coast of Baffin Island. And it's a community of about 1,000 people. And today, Inuit live in, people often ask me, well, do Inuit still live in igloos? No, Inuit don't live in igloos. Probably everyone in this room is aware that Inuit now live in very modern housing that's mostly provided by the government. The Inuit have what social scientists refer to as a mixed economy. So that means that they use hunting and they continue to eat and really rely on the resources provided by the sea. So they eat a lot of seal. Arctic char, they eat narwhal. There are other resources, other kinds of fish and species that they harvest. And they also rely on wage labor and transfer payments, so welfare payments, to buy some food in the grocery store. So here are just a couple of pictures of Inuit living. You can sort of see how much time they spend in the marine environment. This is sort of harvesting berries, and we took a boat to do this berry harvesting trip. And over here you can see this is jigging. Jigging is kind of a competitive fishing exercise that they're doing to see who can catch the first little fish. They're not going to be eating them. They're doing this sort of just for fun, and it's right off of the community that they're doing this, but standing right on the ice. This is the northern store. This is sort of what became of the Hudson's Bay Company. It became a grocery store and a trading store. And this is where Inuit supplement and actually purchase a lot of the food that they eat now. And it's very expensive. So you probably can't really see this, but these are $12 cookies. $20 popcorn, and this is a $200 frozen turkey. So the prices fluctuate of things, and they're the most expensive when things are delivered by airplane. So there are certain foods that are brought in by boat, and anything that's not perishable is brought in by boat. And then other goods are delivered by airplane. This is sort of an anomaly. I mean, this was a real price on a turkey, but you don't usually see prices that high. But it's very expensive to buy food in the store. So Inuit continue to hunt and harvest marine mammals, and this is a picture of a seal butchering that's happening. And here they're eating the cooked seal meat. This was the meat that I showed you. I was stirring the pot, and this is enjoying the meat afterwards. And traditionally, Inuit would use the seal skin, not just eat the seal meat, but also use the seal skin to make clothing. So this is a traditional parka. And here you can see some contemporary and very beautiful sealskin boots that are being sold. This is in Greenland that these are being sold. And there is a wonderful tradition of contemporary fashion using sealskin and coloring and dyeing the sealskin. Until the 1980s, Inuit were able to sell the seal pelts and subsidize their hunting activities through the sale of the pelts. But in the 1970s, a number of environmental organizations led by Greenpeace really did this broad campaign to demonize Inuit hunting. They were also targeting the sealers in Newfoundland, Canada. But they included, all sealing activities in their campaign. And the effect was that Europe passed a seal ban. So the price of seal skins that Inuit was able to receive when they traded their skins went from about $100 a pelt to $10 a pelt. And so this was a really major event in Inuit communities. And since the early 1980s or 70s, really, anyone visiting an Inuit community in the Eastern Arctic has to be very careful to say, I don't work with an environmental organization. I'm not with Greenpeace. I'm not with the World Wildlife Fund, because there's a huge amount of distrust. And that is one of the things I'm going to talk about that's shifting a little bit because of the seismic campaign. So the seismic testing project in Baffin Bay really started around 2011. There was a series of consultations that the company that wanted to do the seismic testing undertook. And so they visited communities. They informed them that they wanted to do a seismic testing project. And then in 2014, the National Energy Board of Canada issued a license approving a 5-year seismic testing project. And in a minute, I'm going to talk to you about what is seismic testing. But just to give you a little bit of context about the political process. So I mentioned that there were consultations. In all of the consultations, there was pretty much unanimous dissent against seismic testing. Nobody wanted to see seismic testing happen. The National Energy Board is an independent regulator of the energy industry, but it's essentially a government entity. And so they had the power to make the decision unilaterally in this case, partly because, as I mentioned, the offshore is not part of the Nunavut land claim. So if the land claim had encompassed the offshore, then that would have triggered the land claim, and co-management bodies at the level of the Nunavut government would have been much more involved in assessing safety and deciding whether or not to go ahead with a seismic testing process. You can see I included this map. This is a map of the way that Clyde River Inuit are using the offshore. So you can see that they tend to use it up to the point of the edge of the landfast ice, and the seismic testing was sort of just past that point. So again, this is the reason that the land claim doesn't encompass the offshore is because it's not part of the traditional use of the environment. The land claim organizations are basically the intermediaries that negotiate between Inuit communities and the Government of Canada. And the land claim organizations could have chosen to be part of the process because of the potential impact on marine mammals. But they really were pretty absent during a lot of these consultations. And this is just a picture taken from the Atlantic, so the marine life is not the same as the Arctic marine life, but the process is the same. It shows what a seismic testing array looks like. So it's a ship, and it drags these very long lines behind it, and attached to the lines are these loud air guns that issue blasts every 10 to 12 seconds, very loud, louder than the noise that a jet engine makes. The noise from seismic testing can be picked up 2,500 miles away from where the seismic testing is taking place. And it happens for 24 hours a day for months on end. So it's just basically this constant bombardment of underwater noise. And so Inuit knew that this was going to affect marine mammals. And indeed, there have been many studies that have shown that there is a large impact on marine mammals and on fish in terms of damage to hearing, decreased catches in fisheries from fish stocks, and marine mammals in particular depend on underwater communication to hunt, to communicate with one another for sort of social purposes. And so a lot of, there have been observations of high levels of stress in marine mammals, area avoidance, and damage to hearing. So when I was visiting the communities, I talked to them about, at some length, about what they had learned from the consultation process and what the concerns were that they had about how they were involved in the decision-making process. And so one of the main areas of concern was that they felt that they really, the process itself was inherently flawed in terms of how Inuit like to engage and like to be consulted. So they talked about the formalism of how the meetings were convened, the timeline, it was rushed. They didn't have a lot of time for people to think and register their perspectives. Inuit elders tend to like to speak extemporaneously and at length, so they don't like to be hurried. And that's not really part of the culture. The Inuit culture is to really be respectful and allow people to speak as long as they need to speak. And they also had a lot of concerns about just the fact that there really, there was a lack of good information, a lack of good science, and a lack of involvement of Inuit knowledge in the decision-making process. And so I have up here some quotes from community members, and I don't like to read the quotes, although I recognize that you probably can't read them yourselves very well. But you know, one of the things that they mentioned is that we know a lot about sea ice up here. You know, we really understand the sea ice and the sea ice dynamics. And we know that if there was an oil spill, it would be a really big problem. And we know that sea ice poses a real hazard to ships and to oil rigs. And that wasn't really reflected in the kind of information that was being shared at the consultations. And similarly, they knew, because they had observed the impacts of seismic testing that happened in the 1980s, that seismic testing had an impact on animals that they were able to see and observe themselves. So they were aware of this impact. But the information shared through the consultation process really didn't accurately reflect any of the knowledge that they already had. And then another area of concern for them was that the way that the decision was made about the seismic testing was focusing just on seismic testing. So there's a process in environmental decision-making called strategic environmental assessment. Some of you may have studied strategic environmental assessment. And there had never been a strategic environmental assessment done in this region. And a strategic environmental assessment looks at all of the different factors and tries to help create a baseline of information so that decision makers can look at an individual project and see how is it situated within all of the different changes that are happening in the marine environment. So in Pond Inlet, which is a community just north of Clyde River, so it's not actually that close, but it is the closest community. I think it's about 500 kilometers away. So it's located at the northern tip of Baffin Island. And they had recently been through the process of the construction of one of the world's largest iron ore mines. And the iron ore mine is now shipping iron ore by boat right past the community. And since the mine had been constructed, they had seen a change in the behavior of narwhal. And narwhal is an important species that they hunt. And they said, well, we don't really know why the narwhal are avoiding this area. It's probably because of the ships from the mine. But across Baffin Bay in Greenland, they've been doing seismic testing. And we've seen some narwhal coming over from that region to our area. And so we know that they're already disturbed by the seismic testing. And then they said, because the sea ice is retreating, we've also seen more killer whale in this region. And killer whale hunt narwhal. So maybe the narwhal are avoiding the killer whale. So we can't really explain it. There's not enough information to know why the behavior of narwhal is changing, but we suspect it's probably from a variety of reasons. And then if we added seismic testing into the equation, that would be sort of one more factor. So they really felt that the process of gathering and aligning different kinds of information was flawed. And then they also said, you know, another problem of overlapping impacts is that communities are constantly being asked to participate in consultations. So in their community, they had been through so many consultations about the mine. When I was there, there was another public workshop consultation to get public opinion about whether they should allow year-round shipping, which would involve breaking the ice to allow the ships to go through year-round, which would mean that Inuit would be cut off from their ability to hunt during the winter months. So there's constant consultation. So not only this, but then the seismic testing consultation. There had been Inuit knowledge consultations done by some of the land claim organizations at the same time. And there's just a real sense of fatigue. Like, we can't keep up with all of this, you know, needing our input into various things. And then finally, you know, they really felt that the underlying philosophy of the consultation process was flawed. So the underlying philosophy, you know, the people who were the National Energy Board and the people leading the process would come in and they would say, the seismic testing is just about gathering information. It's research. Of course, it's applied research, as we all are aware. And Inuit were sort of like, well, yes, but the reason you're collecting that information is for the benefit of oil and gas companies. So it's really, to them, they saw it as part of really of a process that would allow or facilitate offshore development, that they didn't want to happen. And they also really felt like the conclusions had already been arrived at by the people doing the consulting. So these are some quotes where, you know, people are saying the meetings were properly held, but you know, we really felt like they'd already approved the process. They already knew that they were going to approve it before they even came to ask us our opinion. So a sense that they had said no very strongly, and there was no impact from that no. So as a response, after the National Energy Board gave the permit, the Inuit from Clyde River led a very massive campaign, what became a massive campaign to stop the seismic testing from happening. This is a picture of Jerry Natnine, who was the mayor at the time. And Jerry first reached out to the Inuit land claim organizations and said, we would like some legal help. We want to stop this from happening. And for a variety of reasons, the land claim organizations didn't get very involved. They gave them a little bit of money, but they needed a lot more money. And so, interestingly, right about the same time, the new executive director of Greenpeace Canada issued a formal apology for the past actions of Greenpeace, recognizing that there had been a major devastating impact on Inuit livelihoods. And the apology was published in the Nunatsiaq News, which is the regional newspaper of Nunavut, and people read it. And a lot of people felt that they were sincere in apologizing, including Jerry. So Jerry reached out to a number of environmental organizations, including Greenpeace, and Greenpeace was the only environmental organization that responded, and they said, we will pay your legal fees. So there was a sort of a strategic alignment that happened between Greenpeace and Clyde River, where they both wanted to stop the seismic testing from happening. And so when I talked to people about how they felt about Greenpeace, there were sort of a variety of responses. Some people said they apologized, and that was very healing for us. Apology actually means a lot to many Inuit, so you know, they were willing to accept the apology and move forward in collaborating on this project. Others had reservations. So they would say, well, we appreciate the support that we've gotten, but Greenpeace is still in the business of protecting animals. And so they sort of recognized that our interests may not always be the same. So there was a sort of a different opinions about this. But Greenpeace really they followed through in this campaign with not only money, but also social media support and organizing support. And here you can see a protest outside the Court of Appeal, which was hearing the case. And what's notable is that there was no Greenpeace signage. So they didn't brand any of the campaign with Greenpeace. It was all about Clyde River. And that was a really smart strategy, I think, on the part of Greenpeace, because they recognized that this needed to be something that Clyde River owned. And then there were a variety of social media efforts that also came from the community. So this is one where Inuit across the territory really embraced this and got behind this campaign and appreciated the leadership of Clyde River. This is a woman from Iqaluit, Lakaluk Bathory, who had a beautiful picture of herself with her infant in an amautique, and she says, "An ocean without sound is like a song without music. A sea with no animals is death." So Inuit were sending these messages, using these hashtags. There was a Facebook page dedicated to this. This is a man from Iqaluit, Levi Utak, who shared a picture of himself with his sons that are out hunting. And then this is a picture from young Inuit who are participating in an educational program in Ottawa, who are saying, "We stand with Clyde River." So there was a real sharing of messages and pictures across the whole Inuit territory. Another strategy that Inuit used was looking at how to address inequities in knowledge access. So one of the major problems that Inuit have in communities is that researchers come and they do studies and they leave, and the information and knowledge never gets back to the community. And additionally, and perhaps even more importantly, resources aren't allocated for communities to lead their own research projects. So there's a shift that's happening right now where people are becoming more aware of this problem and are trying to reframe how research is done. And so this is a picture of a knowledge atlas that Clyde River is putting together. And the goal is to repatriate a lot of these studies and to put them into an atlas and to visualize them with the explicit goal of making that kind of knowledge and information about the marine environment and the nearshore environment readily available, because they suspect that this will happen again. So they'll be ready next time. And this is, you really can't see this picture at all, but these are some researchers from universities and then 2 community members who are collaborating to put the atlas together. So they're developing some maps, and this is using online cartographic tools, basically, to visualize the information. And then finally, they pursued a legal strategy. So I mentioned that they hired a lawyer. They hired one of the best constitutional lawyers in Canada. The case was heard first at the level of the Court of Appeal in Toronto. And there were 2 aspects to the case at that level. One was whether Inuit from Clyde River even had the right to bring the case against the government of Canada, because I mentioned that the land claim organizations are the official intermediaries. And so there was a question of whether it could come from Clyde River or if it had to come through the land claim organization. So that was the first part of the legal question. The second part, which was also more important, was the consultation conducted correctly? And if not, that would be the basis for stopping the seismic testing to happen. So at the Court of Appeal level, they found, they ruled in favor of Clyde River in terms of being able to bring the case against the government, but they ruled against Clyde River. They said that the consultation was done properly. So it was appealed to the Supreme Court, and it won the Supreme Court case. So the ruling came last July, and this was, I love this picture. It's a little blurry, but they're so delighted. I mean, this is like right after the ruling came in, and you can see Jerry in the middle, and this is the lawyer. Nadar Hassan is the lawyer, and this is Farah Fawcett from Greenpeace. So they're there sort of doing a media event right after the ruling. And the ruling said basically that Canada had failed in its constitutional duty to consult. So the Constitution of Canada has been amended to recognize the treaty rights of First Nations and Inuit and Métis peoples and the requirement to consult. This had happened previously in the 1980s. But then it was a matter of interpretation of what that meant. What does it mean that they have the duty to consult? So in this case, they found that they had failed in deep consultation. So even though they showed up at the community, they gave poor information, the process was rushed, and they didn't make any real changes to the project based on what they heard from community members. So it has a pretty big implication because this will change the way the government does its consultations in the future with other First Nations and Inuit groups around development projects. But there's still a lot of questions that remain, and I think you can't really see it, but Jerry's wearing a shirt that talks about the Chippewa. It says Chippewas Solidarity. The case was heard alongside a case brought by the Chippewas of Ontario that was against Enbridge. It was a pipeline case, and that case they ruled against the Chippewas. So at the end of the day, even deep consultation doesn't give the power to veto a project to First Nations or Inuit peoples. And so there's still, I think there's still some big questions around what does consultation mean and how do we do consultation in a way that is really equitable, and is it even possible to do that? I think there are still a fair number of questions that remain. So a few concluding thoughts. One is about the term meaningful engagement. So, I think there have been increasing criticisms of the concept of consultation, because consultation is usually something that happens at the project level. And so it automatically puts the Indigenous community in question in a defensive role because they're being approached about a project, they're being consulted. But the feedback is that meaningful engagement is an ongoing process of communication. So it needs to happen all the time, continuously, not just when someone wants to come in and extract something or do some kind of project. And in December of 2016, Barack Obama and Justin Trudeau made an announcement in which they said that they were putting the offshore areas of Alaska and Canada, they were making them off limits to development. And on the face of it, this seems like a good announcement, and many Inuit probably celebrated this announcement, but others did not. And the reason was because the announcement sort of came out of nowhere. It was part of Obama's rush to make protected areas towards the end of his presidency, and they didn't consult a lot of the Inuit groups. And so there were Inuit from Western Canada. As you recall, that land claim was a lot of that land claim was about oil and gas and the right to benefit from oil and gas. So that corporation said, wait a minute, first they said, well, in reality, nobody's going to be drilling anytime in the near future, so okay. But you really need to talk to us. Like, we need to be involved in the decision-making process, and that's the whole point. So I think that there are still a lot of questions that are being discussed right now in the wake of this ruling about how to frame engagement and involvement about these large kinds of questions. And the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has a clause called the right to free, prior, and informed consent. And some of the conversation in Canada that's happening right now is about that, the implementation of FPIC. Because the Indigenous groups are saying this is different and additional to the Canadian Constitution. And the government of Canada has said, well, we recognize the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but we already recognize FPIC in the Constitution, so we don't need to do anything else other than guarantee what's already in the Constitution. So there's a discussion around the sort of legal framework for Indigenous rights that's happening in the wake of this ruling. And this is a picture of the Crystal Serenity, which is a large cruise ship that sailed through the Northwest Passage in 2016. It was the first time a cruise ship had gone through those waters, and it had 900 passengers on board. Everyone had paid $20,000 for the joy and pleasure of going through the Northwest Passage. And I think I wanted to include this because the other thing to keep in mind is that there will be more and more people and actors that are interested in accessing the Arctic offshore. And so that's got to be part of this conversation too about meaningful engagement and making sure that Inuit communities are really not only at the table but actually driving the processes of decision making going forward. And then the other point that I wanted to make in closing was just to comment about conservation in the Arctic, because this was a really interesting example of collaboration between Inuit and Greenpeace. And it showed a sort of discursive shift from save the Arctic, these are the animals of the Arctic, that is usually what the conservation organizations are trying to save, to save the Arctic, it's the home of Inuit. So at a discursive level, this sounds great. And I guess I would say that we have yet to see what's going to happen. So this was a good test case, and it showed that, that there has been a shift in thinking, which is really helpful and important and positive shift. Yet I think that really the proof is in, not in the discourse, but in the material effects of these kinds of collaborations. And this is a picture of the community center from Clyde River, and you can't really see it, but there are, Greenpeace went back to Clyde River and installed some solar panels on the community center, and that is, you know, saving the community money. So the question is, what kinds of collaborations might continue or continue to emerge? World Wildlife Fund has also really started to change many of their strategies, and recently they've been working on developing commercial fisheries for Inuit communities in the Canadian Arctic. So there's some recognition now that conservation in the Arctic has to involve Inuit leadership, and it also has to facilitate economic development at the community level for Inuit. So we'll see what happens, but I think it's definitely a positive shift. And this is my last slide. This is a picture from Pond Inlet of a new community-based monitoring project that has been started also in the wake of the seismic testing issue, and they're monitoring marine mammals. And again, like the Clyde River Knowledge Atlas, this is about making sure that they have the information that they can sanction, that they can use moving forward in offshore decision making. And there's a quote from a young woman that I interviewed who said, she was telling me about all of the different research projects that Inuit were leading in this community. And she said that she really found, she said Inuit have stepped up and want to take ownership of research and monitoring. This needs to be Inuit-based and community-based. We need to be ready, we need to be prepared and take our own steps. And then she said, I look forward to the future because I think more and more will come from this. So there was a hopeful feeling of kind of reclaiming and stepping into a leadership role at the community level. And that's sort of where I'd like to leave you today. So, thanks so much.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask the first question since I have the mic, and then I'll invite others. So one of the things that with climate change is that the world that they may have set claim to has changed, right? And you talked about the opening of the passages. Has there been an effort to sort of say our agreement on what constitutes our area needs to change as well? And it seems like that is another piece of it, which is an acknowledgement that old boundaries need to be altered.
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. Yes and no. So the land claim agreements are open to renegotiation, and they have been reopened to look at things that are not working about them. There hasn't been a major effort to say we need to renegotiate this because of climate change, but I think it's a possibility that they're aware exists. Yeah.
Other questions?
I just had a general question. I wanted to ask you who the author was of the book, The Meaning of Ice.
Yeah, Sherry Gearherd, Gearheard, and other co-authors whose names I don't have in my brain right now, but if you look for Sherry's name, you'll find it. Well, I hope it's in the library. I've asked them to order it. So and if they do have it, then, you know, the public can access it as well. I think you can find it on the shelf in the stack. Yeah, and you can also order it. I mean, it's available now in paperback. Oh, and it's been translated into, I think, 3 or 4 different languages, including the indigenous languages of all of the collaborators, with support from the National Science Foundation. And it's a wonderful book, and it's, you know, not inexpensive, but so beautiful that if you order it, you will not regret it. So, yeah.
Has the seismic testing stopped? I mean, was
oh, right. Yeah. Thanks, Julie. Yes. So the Supreme Court ruling ended the seismic testing for now. So, you know, that permit is completely invalid, and if anyone wanted to pursue seismic testing, it would have to go through a whole other process, and the process would have to be pretty different. So, yes, I think that there's no current interest in doing seismic testing. However, having said that, I mentioned that Trudeau and Obama had put the offshore off limits, and of course, the current administration has reversed that and is trying to issue new licenses for the offshore. And in Canada, they included a statement that said that they would revisit that every 5 years. So I don't think we've seen the end of offshore development in the Arctic. Although, you know, the hope is that there will be a shift in the global energy economy such that it will become really economically not feasible, not worth pursuing. But I think we have yet to see whether that's true or not.
Just along the lines of the seismic testing in Antarctica, another ice-covered area. The idea of seismic testing was found by the Marine Mammal Commission, which controlled a lot of the mammal activities, that it was a take of a harvest take if you had seismic testing in the vicinity of marine mammals, because the marine mammals potentially would be deafened and unable to locate the poles they would need to return to the surface to breathe air. And so in which case you would cause the mortality of the seals. Which is a different argument than their behavior. It actually goes to a harvest component.
So you mean they were suggesting a reduction in the allowable harvest?
No. That the activity would be that any marine mammal testing or seismic testing in the vicinity of marine mammals potentially would cause the marine mammal to be deafened in the vicinity where they would have to come out of the ice.
Right.
So under those circumstances, the seismic testing would cause a take, a harvest take, which was not intended by the activity. So it wasn't behavioral change, it was actually a harvest component, which would be prevented under U.S. law as well as other nations' laws.
That's interesting that you mentioned that, because I think that would be an interesting comparison of how was science used in in the Antarctic versus the Arctic in considering the impacts of seismic testing. Maybe we should consider doing that. Okay.
Thank you for a wonderful, inspiring talk. If students were inspired by your talk, what would you suggest if they wanted to pursue career directions in anthropology, in the Arctic? What are thoughts, what are paths that you would recommend?
Great, and again, good question. Well, I think that that there is much work to be done, not only in the Arctic, but, you know, right here in New England, in terms of making more positive relationships with Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples, including around environmental issues. So you wouldn't have to go all the way to the Arctic to do some meaningful and important work. And I think it really is about, you know, sort of coming with an attitude of wanting to support what the community is interested in focusing on. And I think that's the same everywhere, that you want to collaborate with Indigenous peoples. It's sort of coming with an interest in saying, what are you working on, and is there any way I can be helpful? And I suspect that there are a lot of ways that students could find to be helpful. And I think the students that I have in the environmental studies class, or the anthropology class that I'm teaching, you know, we're doing an exercise right now around policy analysis. And you know, I have encouraged them to think about the different NGOs or agencies that they might one day work in, and how they could design policies that were really about allowing communities to be much more in control. So I think there's lots of ways to be involved.
Thank you for your talk. I found really interesting the tension between the Indigenous community and the Greenpeace or the environmental organization that I hadn't really given much thought to previously. I was just wondering if that's a phenomenon that was sort of specific to this case that you were researching, or if that's a more widespread phenomenon where the Indigenous interests don't always align with environmental.
Oh, that's a really great question. Thank you for that question. Well, first of all, I have to recommend a film that everyone should see. It's called Angry Inuk, and it's by a young Inuit filmmaker, Althea Arnakuk-Bernil, and it's about this issue about Greenpeace and what happened to Inuit after the Greenpeace got involved with this field campaign. It's a really wonderful film, so go see the film. But that doesn't answer your question. So the answer is that this is a much more widespread problem. So there's a whole sort of field of anthropology, which is the anthropology of conservation. And that subfield has really tracked some of the dynamics between conservation organizations and conservation interests and local peoples around the world. And the global environmental organizations have a real track record of coming in to save wildlife or to preserve the rainforest and not being attentive to what the impacts of that will be on local peoples. So this is a global problem, and there's actually a really good and robust kind of literature about it, so it's worth looking into that. Or maybe doing a course in environmental studies on the anthropology of conservation, because there's actually a lot of really good learning that's being done in that area.
Could I just ask how someone who grew up in Vermont ended up working in the Arctic and getting interested in this? What was your trajectory?
That's a good question. Yeah, I sometimes give a cautionary tale to students, actually, where I say, at the beginning of my talk, I said, this is how many of us enter into the Arctic. We see these images, and that's kind of how we perceive the Arctic. And so for me, I was a early doctoral student. I had done work in the tropics. I was interested in climate change, and I read a series in the New York Times on the changing Arctic. And one of the articles was about the Inuit Circumpolar Council and their work on reframing climate change as a human rights issue. And I just got really interested, and a series of things happened that allowed me to go do the work. I think it could have happened otherwise. It could have been that I didn't get the funding. It's very expensive to do research in the Arctic. Or there could have been many things that would have gotten in the way and not allowed it to happen. So it was sort of some combination of my interests and then just how life sometimes aligns itself in a certain way. I didn't even like the cold growing up in Vermont. I couldn't wait to get to warmer territory. So you never know.
Well, thank you again, Noor, and let's give her another hand. And I'm sure if you have any questions, I'm sure she could stay for a few minutes and chat with you. So please feel free to come forward.